Good afternoon, Patriots, and welcome to the 89th audio file in the audiocast series known as the Q News Patriot. I am the Q News Patriot. My name is SGAnon. Patriots, obviously, the symbolism for our file today, 89, 8 plus 9 being 17, is sort of fascinating and appropriate given the flavor of the file that we're going to have. We have a number of reasons, Patriots, to understand that we are winning resolutely the culture war, the Great Awakening progression of events here in the world. And we need only look in the appropriate places to understand the machinations of things that are happening, and also to understand that the war itself continues to march forward. This is an active, real-time unfolding of events, an active exposure of the silent processes that have been going on in the covert landscape and shadows for a very long time, out into the public fore, and they will eventually arrive at very large-scale levels of exposure and criminality happening against the American people and the peoples of the world, which will ultimately require some form of militarized and very severe civilian justice. Patriots, President Trump is telling us as we go through this process that he is being resisted by those forces, and those forces are becoming increasingly more desperate. And he's simultaneously pointing out to us, just as in with recent days with respect to the desk issue that occurred at the White House, that we have the initiative and control of the key arenas and sectors, both domestically and internationally, to resist their resistance and out-endure them through the war. I'm extremely excited to get into all of the research I've aggregated for the file today. I think many of you are going to be encouraged at the military activities that are happening both domestically and internationally, as well as the irregular warfare components of civilian and business society that are affecting a number of things here in the West. Without further ado, Patriots, let's go ahead and get right to it. We're going to go ahead and start our file today, Patriots, with a number of different citations and headlines in recent days showing the escalated nature and the severity of many of the joint training, so-called training operations that are happening in the Western world and around the planet with respect to very important and critical components of the United States military and other international partners. These headlines taken just from the last 14 days. This one from PACCOM.mil. Bamboo Eagle 25-1 tests forces in a combat representative environment. The U.S. Air Force Warfare Center recently wrapped up Bamboo Eagle 25-1, concluding a series of coordinated operations that involved more than 10,000 personnel from multiple Air Force commands, joint services, and allied air forces. Now, there's that joint services component again, Patriots. We know that a number of these things happening in various spheres of regional operation, influence, and control feature a joint flavor to them. Taken from Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Manglitz, 393rd Expeditionary Bomb Squadron Commander. Bamboo Eagle provides us an opportunity to align with the warrior ethos mentality. It's one thing to train at home, and we train hard at home, but it's even better to bring a subset of our base on the road here and work together to generate air power alongside the rest of the combat air force and our allies. Participants engaged in a series of complex missions designed to simulate the ever-evolving challenges of modern warfare. Back on the ground, maintenance teams worked around the clock to support distributed operations and ensure that all aircraft remained mission ready amid the demanding operational tempo. It can be a tough job and sometimes it's thankless, but the maintenance crews do it anyway, said First Lieutenant Benjamin Brooks, Maintenance Officer, 366th Maintenance Squadron. The multinational nature of the exercise provided additional opportunities for cross-service learning and integration. Who did President Trump just recently name as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Patriots, right? Wasn't that Air Force General Dan Raisin Kane, right? And Raisin Kane's experience, his professional experience, is in interagency cooperation. This is something President Trump highlighted in TruthSocial. So he's letting us know what lens, what operational motif overall, what governing mindset, ethos, philosophy is being implemented inside the U.S. military, which is going to root out, of course, the saboteurs, the entrenched interests, and the traitors that have been hiding behind desks in those offices and in those bunkers and in those buildings for a very long time. Coming a little bit further down in the article, Bamboo Eagle also included E-7A crews. E-7A had a number of opportunities to integrate with U.S. command and control entities. This is important because the E7's capability, Patriots, of course, exists across the entirety of the domain, from surveillance to electronic warfare, etc. Based on previous integration, a number of the tactics and procedures that we have in place are similar, but during Bamboo Eagle, because of the differences with agile combat employment, we were able to gain a common understanding of how to do this with limited information. Bamboo Eagle tested our ability to integrate the tactical effects we trained to in Red Flag from dispersed forces and under distributed command and control, said RAF. So this is Royal Air Force, GP Captain Guy Lefroy, UK Detachment Commander. Throughout the exercise, we developed our people's ability to dynamically deliver air power through empowerment, effective risk management, and ultimately sharpen our individual service. The article concludes, Patriots, by saying that Bamboo Eagle 25-1 provided an advanced, multi-domain, and realistic training environment aimed at preparing U.S. and allied forces for evolving demands of modern warfare. So, of course, we understand that rooting out the secret technological component of the entrenched deep state interest that still exists, and that particular component, of course, has been severely limited in its capabilities throughout the last 7 years because of an ongoing war. But we know that rooting the rest of that out is going to require the broader component of militarized allied forces in the Western world, what we would call patriotic white hat militarized forces, to understand the true landscape, to be prepared for the true nature of that conflict and battle. It cannot stay just a special operational procedure. It will have to be, according to Q, 20% overt for conclusion of the process that we're all going through. So this is a part of the preparation of that. Another article taken from February 19th from the Expeditionary Center of the Air Force, 521st Contingency Response Squadron battles cold in Operation Pacific Dagger. This occurred in Massachusetts, which I find very fascinating for a reason that we're going to highlight here in just another minute. But from Westover Air Reserve Base, so this is Air Reserve reservists, nearly 100 airmen from the 521st Contingency Response Squadron practice airbase opening mission during Pacific Dagger at Westover Air Reserve, Massachusetts, February 4 through 8. Many historic, let me come over here. Many historic American military operations in the Pacific were set through steaming jungles, but U.S. Indo-Pacific Command area of responsibility includes cold and snowy places as well. Pacific Dagger, an exercise designed to test skills needed in an Indo-PACOM contingency scenario, included a new desired learning objective for the 521st Contingency Response Hydra's, Patriots, cold weather operations. The Westover's 439th Airlift Wing Dog Patch training area hosted tents, generators, a forklift, and bundled up airmen. Well, your symbolism is pretty plain right there, Patriots. What we've got here are the Hydras literally training, or excuse me, the force engaging the Hydras literally training in a cross-domain, joint domain operation, including new desired learning objectives and officially for a contingency scenario is what I'm trying to say there. Our mission is simple but complex. It's to rapidly assess, open, operate, sustain, and defend expeditionary fields and aerial ports. So this is a rapid deployment training exercise as well. The reason we're out here today is we're putting the Hydras through a pretty tough expeditionary test, said Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Frost, commander of the squadron. Stay frosty, right? We put the whole contingent's response element through these cold weather paces while dealing with difficult force protection, condition change injects, and chemical and biological attack injects, and our airmen fulfilled and passed the test. Contingency response airmen, coming down here a little further in the article, routinely practice responding to chemical and biological threats as well as armed opposing forces, right? So we're talking about the exact same type of response needed if we were to experience a COVID-19 2.0 in the world, right? Patriots, when we think back onto that unpleasant summer, spring, summer, and fall season of 2020, one of the things we have to realize is we were attacked. It was an absolute act of world war against the peoples of the Western world and against the entirety of the planet by extension. And so now we have literal training happening inside the contingency response component of the U.S. Air Force Reserve, practicing responding to those exact types of threat conditions being offered, including armed opposing forces on the ground. So Antifa is a terrorist organization. Cartels are terrorist organizations. They qualify then as armed opposing forces on the ground. And the article concludes with, in the wooded winterscape, or this part of the article concludes with, in the wooded winterscape at Westover, the Hydras found themselves scraping freezing rain off gas masks and knocking ice from their weapons before they could engage the enemy during a firefight. So this was a very realistic, rapid force deployment condition exercise happening to help train our men and women into understanding quick response and also difficult conditions against potentially extenuating events like very large scale attacks that are of civilization pausing, right? You would like to think that a chemical attack of a true national nature or an international or biological event would certainly cause, a response that would be needed to pause society. And that's one of the things that the entity called Q has sort of hinted at along in this process, telling us that we will eventually arrive at a point where an emergency alert is activated, where there is a deployment of the military to domestically protect the republic. And what I find very interesting about the biological and chemical component is that on the exact same day, an article is released from the U.S. Army, Army.mil. Army units trained for nuclear forensics missions during Exercise Prominent Hunt. Now, we know nuclear source material went missing essentially in New Jersey, in the New Jersey area of influence, reported to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission at the federal level sometime in December. I think it was around December 7th, December 2 through 7, somewhere in there. And so this article and training exercise occurred. This article put out on the 19th of February stating that this training exercise occurred January 27th through 30th. So that would have been right around a month after that in New York. Highly specialized units from the U.S. military's premier chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosives command trained for nuclear forensics missions at Exercise Prominent Hunt in New York, January 27, through 30, 2025. 20th CBRNE command soldiers from a nuclear disablement team and a CBRNE response team validated readiness to serve on the National Technical Nuclear Forensics Ground Collection Task Force, led by the FBI, the NTNF Ground Collection Task Force gathers and packages samples of radioactive fallout that enable partner agencies to determine the source of the radiation. So they're literally training to track nuclear threatening or nuclear style threatening materials anywhere in the world, of course, domestically being an area of operation for components of the Army through the National Guard, but really anywhere in the world. And so that's another example of the evolving warfare and the evolving threat landscape that is offered when we start shaking out the real hydras, to utilize the terminology from a moment ago, when we start threatening the position of those individuals out there in the world who have maintained a great deal of power and control over very dark levels of criminality for a long time, because those levels of criminality and those operational features that they've inputted into society are necessary for them as a point of religious worship. And I cannot stress that enough, Patriots. So I'm going to read one more article here taken from spaceforce.mil, and then we're going to move into that irregular warfare component happening, I believe, here in the United States homeland, even still under this current Trump administration. I believe Trump 3.0. Many people would argue and say 2.0. But regardless here, coming back to spaceforce.mil, Minuteman III test launch showcases the readiness of U.S. nuclear forces, safe, effective deterrence. From Vandenberg Space Force Base, California, a joint team of Air Force Global Strike Command, Airmen and Vandenberg Space Force Guardians launched an unarmed Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile equipped with a single telemeter joint test assembly reentry vehicle from Vandenberg Space Force Base. The Western Range at Vandenberg serves as the primary testing ground for Air Force Global Strike Command's ICBM deterrent. This test launch is part of routine and periodic activities designed to demonstrate that the U.S. nuclear deterrent remains safe, secure, reliable, and effective in 21st century threats and reassuring allies. Today's Minuteman III test is just one of the ways the Department of the Air Force demonstrates the readiness, precision, and professionalism of U.S. nuclear forces, said Acting Air Force Secretary Gary Ashworth. It also provides confidence in the lethality and effectiveness of the nation's nuclear deterrence mission. All right, Patriots. So obviously, when we were, launching off, missiles and test firing things and things of that nature, we have to appreciate that there is a component of an irregular war that has to be maintained from a psychological posturing and positioning always. Whenever you're in a warfare scenario, you must always appear capable, even when you're attempting to appear deceptively weak or diminutive compared to a threat that could be superior, or a threat that is at least equally capable, such as Russia's very formidable nuclear arsenal. And so this is, I think, a reminder for our deep state opponents, if I can be so brash as to say this, that we do have capability to hit them where it hurts in arenas of operational control around the world that most of the general public does not know about, and the capability to do so through Space Force, through a joint operation. Again, this is another joint interoperability expression of what's going on inside the U.S. military through Space Force and Air Force Global Strike Command being very important for the deployment of aerial projectiles, both missiles and otherwise, all around the rest of the planet. I think this is a clear message. Another thing that I think is more than a clear message, however, Patriots, is the underground component of the warfare situation that has been going on all around the planet for the last many years. We've tracked that pretty exhaustively, and we've clearly seen the artificial ignition of many different earthquakes that can be attributed probably to both sides when we evaluate the presence of EOD military teams in the geographic proximity, as well as lasers that have been literally tracked from radar and active satellite projection systems here in the world. We have the ability to see that there's clearly an underground component to the conflict, and that has clearly continued even through this COG period of time in the United States, and even up until the very present day. Give me just a moment here. I'm going to pull up a screenshot that I took from the US Geological Survey.gov, so that's usgs.gov. This screenshot now expired, of course, because it was taken from the active earthquake activity tracker over there. This has been from just a few days ago. Let me see here, from February the 20. Let me make sure that I have my date completely right, Patriots. I need to pull up my reference over here just to ensure that I've got it accurate. So this having come out on the 22nd of February, so just a couple of days ago here, 3 days ago by my watch. Let me pull this up. Now, this is taken from the western coastal areas of California, west of the Highway 25 out there, and just a little bit northeasterly of Highway 101, dead east of the town Salinas. Salinas is an interesting community, Patriots, when we look at the history post-World War II, during World War II, and post-World War II military history here in this arena, as well as its proximity, of course, to the ocean and major highway systems going over here throughout this arena. I wish I was able to show you a more advanced view of it. I guess I could pull that up over here on a map with respect to Salinas itself. Give me just a moment here. All right, so here is the town of Salinas. We have Hollister, Pinoque, Gonzales. This is the Pacific Grove at Monterey. For perspective, bring it out a little bit more, and then further inland here inside the state, we have Fresno. So we're essentially dead west of the Fresno area, approximately halfway up the state or so, just a little bit over halfway up the state here. But what was so striking about this particular arena, those earthquakes, for your reference on this particular map, would have been about in this area, maybe a little bit further throughout here. Let's go ahead and pull that up. What is so striking about this, Patriots, is the fact that these earthquakes, when I initially measured them the day that I captured that screenshot, they all measured within half a kilometer of the same depth of one another. I think the most shallow one was 2.9, and the deepest one was right around 4.2. And they all, or excuse me, right around 3.5, and they all concentrated right in this particular area. I've drawn a line here over to what is formerly the U.S. Army Air Base at Salinas. And so this is now the Salinas Municipal Airport over in this region. It does have a couple of functional runways. It used to be the Army Air Base in World War II, and immediately after that. And this arena over here was the larger Army station of Fort Ord, O-R-D. Now, Fort Ord was an absolute jewel of the U.S. Army during World War II and immediately afterward. The fort was decommissioned. I believe it was in the late 1960s or 70s. And we'll get into that here in just a moment. Don't quote me quite yet on that. But what was so fascinating is the concentration of these earthquakes being on top of one another in this fashion is almost statistically impossible if you're talking about organic geologic activity. You're talking about a hyper-concentrated multi-earthquake event, all happening really within the same about 1 mile square, maybe a 1.5 mile square of one another. And it's right in the valley between these mountains near this particular highway. It's also just across from much larger roads over here. And there's a valley that runs southwesterly. Oh, right there. I guess we're going to draw that line there too as well. And then there's a valley that runs through here, and it's actually across the county jurisdictional line. So I highlight this and I bring this up to show out that we have components of this operation that are happening, which we can say have to be attributed to something more than just organic, natural activities of the earth. And so when we look at the underground war, when we look at the deployment of U.S. Marines in California in response to these fires, right? When we look at the deployment of U.S. Marines to California, to the border and other arenas, when we look at the unusual activity levels of the Marine Corps, of the U.S. Army National Guard with respect to California, all of the different international military forces that have been in and out of the Californian airspace, operating, and we can see them, of course, on maps and transponders operating out of those arenas. Just in the last 6 months, I think I've seen more than 10 of them. It makes a great deal of sense that we would be mapping and potentially targeting old world infrastructure, old component forces of this deep state underground system that perhaps at one time branched off or were built into the sides of mountains very near military bases or U.S. government installations or secret sites that needed the access, perhaps even needed security at some point in time, but of course can be used for very dark levels of criminality, and many of them have. Coming over here to militarymuseum.org, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Salinas Army Air Base, this taken from the Goleta Valley Historical Society. Efforts to build a new airfield at Salinas to replace the first field dedicated in 1929 began in January 1940. Interest on the part of the local Chamber of Commerce started the process of planning the lead up, to engineering drawings and a bond election for funding of $185,000 by June of 1940. The Army agreed to lease the land and to authorize the use of WPA funds for construction. Work began in October 1940. $310,000 was appropriated for the main runways. All buildings except for the hangar had been completed by the end of December 1940. So this is a one-year project, Patriots. 4 two-story barracks and 2 one-story barracks, plus a control tower, admin building, mess hall, and classrooms were some of the buildings ready to be occupied by soldiers in 1941. The base was the home of 2 observation squadrons, one from Hamilton Field north of San Francisco, and the other which was formed at Salinas Base. The Salinas Municipal Airport became a 4th Air Force base, on January 20th of 1941. The first commander was Captain W.C. Sams, who flew to the Salinas Base from Hamilton Field. The airmen arrived a week later and began to organize and settle into the facilities that had just been completed. The first flying cadets arrived May 1941, the first training aircraft at the end of May, and in August 1941, a medical detachment was activated at the base. So that's a really important part of this history, Patriots. What has been occurring in a lot of the underground connections to bases potentially like this? And I'm saying that we have potential proximity that could suggest an underground connection, but without further investigation, it's impossible to conclude. But one of the things that we know happens in these underground situations, and has for a long time, is medical experimentation, research, observation, data collection, etc., testing, those types of things. And so I find it very interesting that just almost immediately after we fielded and mustered the forces for this particular Army Air Base, that we have a medical detachment being activated there. The first P-38 Lightnings arrived in August 1941 to be used by a coastal patrol group stationed there. The first edition of the base newspaper, called The Observer, was published November 21st, 1941. Much of the final construction was not completed until April 1942. The Salinas Air Base was also used to train bomber pilots out of Hammer Field on the TP-70Bs, and was used at the end of the war as an out-processing station. Fremont Peak Radar Training Site was nearby as well, so that would have had an intersection and a knowledge of aerial phenomena, including UFOs, right? Radar training in those days being our main methodology of detection. as was a radio range station and a small arms range. The Salinas rodeo grounds were used to gather up Japanese Americans prior to relocation to camps. In 1946, the base was closed and 900 acres transferred to the city of Salinas. So there's our date there, Patriots, just for correction from earlier and for reference. Many of the buildings were demolished or sold and moved. The original old American Legion Airport became part of the Santa Lucia Elementary School and the Sherwood Gardens. The former Salinas Air Base dates back to 1938 when the city purchased approximately 600 acres to develop the airport. Let me see here. Between 1942 and 1945, the Army Air Forces acquired additional property, increasing the base size to 900 acres. The site was deeded to the city of Salinas after October 21st, 1946 for use as a municipal airport. Since then, most of the buildings have been demolished and replaced. All right. Sort of right alongside there, on the other side of the town, actually, is this structure called Fort Ord. I've come up with a couple of different articles for this, but one of the articles I thought was absolutely fascinating was this article because it comes, of course, with pictures, Patriots. So give me just a moment here. I'm going to read this article with each of you and have us follow along. Going to look at some of these pictures first. So this is abandoned structures at Fort Ord, again, in Monterey Bay area, Salinas, just sort of southwesterly, about 1.5 miles from Salinas proper. So we have these photos here. Graffiti there. Internal structures. So clearly there's been activity that is what we would call perhaps not very friendly occurring inside these buildings. Go through these. So these are some of the, this looks like potentially the mess hall from the outside. This potentially a latrine house. Pictures taken from the base itself, views in the surrounding countryside. And again, these look like barrack structures here. A lot of overgrowth, a lot of vegetative overgrowth. So this is an area that's been essentially abandoned and not re-inhabited even by the locals for going on nearly a century now. So let's come down the article here. Fort Ord, once the jewel of the U.S. Army. Founded in 1917 as a target range for field artillery, situated 45 square miles of dunes and forests along the coast of Monterey Bay. It was considered fortunate to be stationed at Fort Ord as the surroundings were picturesque and the weather beautiful. It is classed as a national monument, Patriots, on Reservation Road, Salinas, California. At its height, Fort Ord was home to upwards of 50,000 troops, serving as the staging area for soldiers of the Korean and Vietnam War. This installation had an action-packed life for nearly 80 years until the Base Realignment and Closure Commission recommended its closure in 1988. So the Salinas Army Air Base closed in 1946, but this fort continued to operate until the Reagan administration. Under the guidance of the commission, the EPA ran an assessment of the Army base's environmental impact, and the results were not promising. Within the 45 square miles were underground storage tanks leaking petroleum into groundwater, landfills, dump sites, and unexploded mines. The fort was closed in 1994, the largest of the military's bases to be shut down and placed on the national priorities list as a Superfund site, one of the most toxic places in America. For those out there that would like to continue reading the article, you can find it at atlasobscura.com/places/Fort Ord. Something I find equally as exciting, Patriots, about the potential removal of certain threatening underground infrastructure and the success of homeland defense operations here in the United States of America is the surface visible component of the deep state war, the other side of our victory coin, if we want to call it that we have access to each and every day, unfolding right now before our very eyes in real time. We've seen now the successful confirmation of Kash Patel, a name to remember according to the entity online called Q, as the new acting FBI director, as the new FBI director for a 10-year period of time. And he's now been appointed in that period of time the acting director of one of the most tyrannical sub-law enforcement organizations inside the U.S. executive branch, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. I think this is absolute evidence in real time, Patriots, of two major conclusions that we can take away with the future of the deep state bureaucracy and their efforts at disempowering and running roughshod over Americans' basic original constitutional protections. And one of them is that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives is going to be merged with the Federal Bureau of Investigation before this process is over. I purport that the reason for that occurring is because of the access we would have as patriotic forces inside the United States corporate government structure to things such as databases and communication spreadsheets and pathways that have been occurring inside the ATF for a number of years and decades, allowing us to showcase a number of facilitative components for the actual gun-based terrorism that's been happening on the ground. In other words, to go inside the ATF, examine their records, and find out exactly how they have assisted in things such as school shootings, domestic terrorism, and ignoring certain individuals and certain classes of people with respect to true illegal gun and illegal firearm crimes. You know, this is not just a pie in the sky prediction either, Patriots. I'm looking at the landscape playing out, and it very much appears that this is the pathway forward to consolidate and then eventually dissolve and disband federal executive branch law enforcement structures, because of course the Constitution for our republic does not make allocation for that. But when we appreciate the history as well behind this topic, it was also the plan of our deep state opponent at one point in time to accomplish and push for the exact same merger and the exact same incorporation, but in a way intended to further strain and potentially stress to the breaking point the ability of our constitutional protection, especially around that of the Second Amendment, to prevent the encroachment of the bureaucracy. This taken from a 2015 article from the American Centers for Progress, the Centers for American Progress, which is found at americanprogress.org. The Bureau and the Bureau, a review of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and a proposal to merge it with the FBI. After 2 years of research into ATF's history, work, and challenges, Centers for American Progress recommends merging it into the FBI to create a federal law enforcement agency with the leadership, resources, and political support necessary to help reform the gun industry and reduce gun violence in the United States. So this is clearly a political maneuver, was a political maneuver being contemplated and pushed for under the Barack Obama administration. We know that the ATF itself is included under the United States Department of Justice. When Eric Holder was a part of that Department of Justice, a number of really unbelievable, seditious, and treasonous activities occurred inside that department. We know that the IRS was weaponized. We know that the ATF was extremely weaponized. But one of the things that I find absolutely powerful now that we have a new landscape, a different game board, a different terrain and topography, Patriots, to work with respect to Kash Patel being the acting director of the ATF and the new FBI director, is we now have access to all of the information that ATF has been, aggregating, compiling, analyzing, and storing for a long time. Things like criminal organizations, the illegal use and trafficking of firearms. How did Barack Obama, for example, get 600,000 firearms into the hands of the cartels? How do firearms end up in the hands of individuals, 17, 18, 19 years old, who would not be able to pass even the most basic background checks in most U.S. jurisdictions just based on age? The illegal use and storage of explosives, acts of arson, acts of bombing, coordinated acts of firearm terrorism. These are the types of databases that the ATF has been generating on everyone for a long time, with an inverted purpose behind it, of course, with the wrong reasoning, but that can be utilized to our effect in a patriotic environment if it is already constitutionally allowed. If it's already legally allowed. I apologize for the mix-up there on the terminology. If it's already legally allowed according to U.S. code and regulation, and if we can work with inside those particular U.S. codes and regulations to further destroy the bureaucracy itself. And I believe that's exactly what we're seeing happening in real time. And again, I'm expecting Kash Patel to permanently eliminate and absorb the ATF into the FBI. President Trump has told us recently, in recent days, that the forces that seek to destabilize our world are not stopping. With respect to the events pertaining to the Resolute desk, and I believe those events occurred on the 19th. Yes, the 19th of February, 2025, announced on the president's TruthSocial. This is a highlighting of just what is occurring and the active back and forth that's happening because of the positioning on the the larger battlefield, if you will, that we have as patriots with respect to what I just highlighted a moment ago, and in other positions as well. This post from the president's TruthSocial, 9:36 p.m., so 21:36 military time on the 19th of February 2025. A president after election gets a choice of 1 in 7 desks. Well, that's not true, patriots. A president gets a choice of 1 in 6 desks that have been used inside the Oval Office over the last 115 years. But this is clearly 1 in 7, a nod to 17. This desk, the CNO, which is very well known and was used by President George H.W. Bush and others. That's important, patriots, because George H.W. Bush was the only president to utilize this desk. So, and others is clearly referring to other forces, has been temporarily installed in the White House while the Resolute desk is being lightly refinished. A very important job. This is a beautiful but temporary replacement. 2 days later, it was published online that listening devices were found inside the Resolute desk, and this was the reason for the removal, not a light refinishing. So this was President Trump's irregular warfare message to us, a communication to let us know that a situation had developed, it was being investigated, all measures of precaution and safety were being taken, and we were utilizing symbolism in the reverse direction, of course, with the reference to 17 and the CNO desk itself, which has a fascinating history. We're utilizing symbolism to literally show it simultaneously to our deep state opponents that we are responding to those threats, we are responding to their attempts, and we see them. So this taken from, let me see here, if I can get this webpage to work, patriots, I apologize. Taken from Twitter, X, formerly Twitter, February 21st, 2025, in a shocking revelation that has rippled Washington. Sources inside the White House confirmed that the Oval Office, including the Resolute desk, was subjected to a high-level security sweep following credible suspicions of covert surveillance. The sweep reportedly uncovered sophisticated listening devices, leading to the immediate removal of the president's desk for a comprehensive off-site scan. Specialized teams using cutting-edge radio frequency detection technology were dispatched, and initial findings pointed to concealed audio surveillance devices hidden within the desk. Now, what is equally fascinating is with the timing of that particular truth from President Trump, being 9:36 p.m. Eastern time, 21:36 EST. If we come over here to the Q drops, the Q boards, and we go to drop 936, this comes back to March the 10th, so 310 or 13, which is a very interesting number as it pertains to the occultic symbolism, the occultic nature of the true masters of the Western world political class. And drop 936 includes an image of several high-ranking Nazis giving the Nazi salute alongside clergy. Now, who is in the hospital in the present day and time, patriots? Excuse me. Who's in the hospital with the present day and time having difficulty and potentially kidney failure? I believe that is the current Pope Francis. And so the drop reads, of course, it cites the image at the top and then reads, the Nazi order, NWO, N does not refer to new. The sum of all fears. So there's that reference again, patriots, right? North Korea, POTUS, hostage, threat, disarm, stage set, freedom. So this is President Trump telling us, in my opinion, patriots, that we are up against those forces that are going to begin this overt public sequence of events. They are attempting to put every last-ditch effort possible into stopping the America First world-changing agenda. They're attempting to covertly spy on the President of the United States once again inside his own office, probably left over from the outgoing situation there. And so we have a number of historic implications from the choice of the desk that President Trump utilized to respond to these very individuals, right? The occultic masters that have a multinational influence on the political behavior of the elected class in all sorts of nations, including the United States. If we come over here to livemint.com discussing the CNO desk, give me a moment here. Oh, I apologize. That was the wrong resource. So let me come over here, patriots. Sometimes we have to adapt as we're on the move, right? This taken from a decor website mentalfloss.com, created for the owners of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad Company in 1920. George H.W. Bush was attached to this desk in particular. So Timberwolf, the individual that we saw a number of people at that funeral, the funeral for H.W. Bush, who were first given cards to understand what was really happening with respect to the exposure and the death of the American deep state political class. The article states he had used it during his tenure as vice president and brought it over to become his Oval Office desk when he became president. So this was the desk that H.W. Bush sold out the United States of America on. This was the desk that H.W. Bush utilized in that 1980, I believe it was 1989 to 1993 time frame, the same time frame where we saw the total collapse of the Soviet Union at the behest of the activities of the Western world central banking and occultic mafia. This was the desk that all of that happened at. The move apparently ruffled a few feathers in the 90s. People wondered if there was a political motive for replacing the Resolute desk that had become associated with Kennedy. Bush's press secretary eventually made a statement saying that he had it at vice president, he got used to it and found it comfortable. Now, the history of the C&O desk itself is absolutely fascinating. It was first built in 1920 by the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway Company to be utilized for some of the company's owners. After a series of mergers, the company that was once C&O donated the desk to the White House. That was CSX Transportation Patriots, just for reference, where it was placed later in the Oval Office study. Now, if we go to the C&O Railway Company, we find some very interesting things, and especially as it pertains to the desk itself. But let's go all of the way back to C&O Railroad. The American industrialists and the railway magnate that essentially created the C&O Railroad and its large footprint there on the eastern seaboard was a gentleman named Collis Potter Huntington. This was an individual who, in my opinion, was a traitor to the American Republic, was actively working on behalf of banking partners and industrialist partners, having heavy checkbooks to essentially subvert the lawful republic. I'm not going to go so far as to say advance an occult agenda. It's difficult to find a lot of proof on that from these 19th century figures, but certainly someone that was interested from the public sense, from the business sense, from the legal sense, consolidating the entirety of major national infrastructure under private interests, and then extorting the republic and eventually incorporating the republic as a result of that, based on the time frame, which you'll get to hear in just a moment. So let me see here. This taken from the lying Wikipedia, but it helps to give us a little bit of an overview. This was an individual who invested in the ideas to build the Central Pacific Railroad as part of the first U.S. transcontinental railroad system. He later helped lead and develop other major lines, such as Southern Pacific and the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, which he was recruited to help complete. That railway, which was completed 1873, so just 2 years after the Organic Act of Columbia, fulfilled a long-held dream of Virginians of a rail link from James River to the Ohio River Valley. Turning attention later to the eastern end of the line at Richmond, Huntington directed C&O's Peninsula extension in the 1880s, which opened a pathway for West Virginia bituminous coal, and he is also credited with the development of Newport News shipbuilding and dry dock, as well as the incorporation of Newport News, Virginia as a new city. So this was a guy acting directly on behalf of the central banksters and the industrialists and the tycoons that literally took over the United States of America and subverted our Republican lawful system. Much of the railroad and industrial development that Collis Huntington envisioned and led are still important activities in the 21st century. Southern Pacific is now part of Union Pacific, and the C&O became part of CSX Transportation. From his base of operations in Washington, D.C., Huntington was a lobbyist for the Central Pacific and the Southern Pacific Railroads in the 1870s and 80s. The Big Four railway magnates had built a powerful political machine, which he had a large role in running. He was generous in providing bribes to politicians and congressmen. Revelations of his misdeeds in 1883 made him one of the most hated industrialists in the nation. So this is clearly a man out to enslave his fellow man for a buck. I would characterize him no different than the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the J.P. Morgans, the Warburgs, and others. One of the things that I find absolutely compelling and fascinating about this particular choice of desk, Patriots, is President Donald Trump has replaced the Resolute desk temporarily with this particular desk as he participates in actively bringing conflicts to a close around the world and actively pouring what I would characterize as irregular warfare fuel on other components and constructs of different conflicts to fragment and separate them. In other words, this is now the desk that sits in the Oval Office as the President of the United States begins the long and arduous process of undoing what the tycoons of the 19th century, the banksters of Western Europe, and the fraudsters inside the United States of America actually did to the great American Republic, and highlighting the strategy that is being utilized, at least from the pulpit of the presidency, with respect to all of this, is another truth put out by President Trump. This one 2 days later on the 21st of February, so 2125, where he terminated General Charles C.Q. Brown for as the operating member of the current Joint Chiefs of Staff, the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and nominated Air Force Lieutenant General Dan Raisin Kane. Now, this truth is very, very fascinating, Patriots, for a number of different reasons. I'm going to read the truth for you very quickly. Then we're going to break some of it down, move into our closing segments here. We've been on for just a little while. I know each of you are sort of, perhaps getting a little bit tired of some of the details, so we'll try and conclude here in a few moments. I want to thank General Charles C.Q. Brown for his over 40 years of service to the country, including as our current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's a fine gentleman and an outstanding leader, and I wish a great future for him and his family. Today, I am honored to announce that I am nominating Air Force Lieutenant General Dan Raisin Kane to be the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs. General Kane is an accomplished pilot, national security expert, successful entrepreneur, and a warfighter with significant interagency and special operations experience. So he's telling you right there, Patriots, the attitude and the lens that's coming to the joint services at their highest consular sort of level. During my first term, Raisin was instrumental in the complete annihilation of the ISIS caliphate. It was done in record-setting time, a matter of weeks. Many so-called military geniuses said it would take years to defeat ISIS. General Kane, on the other hand, said it could be done quickly, and he delivered. Despite being highly qualified and respected to serve on the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the previous administration, General Kane was passed over for promotion by sleepy Joe Biden, but not anymore. Alongside Secretary Pete Hegseth, General Kane and our military will restore peace through strength, put America first, and rebuild our military. Rebuild our military. Finally, I have also directed Secretary Hegseth to solicit nominations for 5 additional high-level positions, which will be announced soon. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Now, one of the very first things I saw in this particular post, Patriots, is the fact that he referred to General Charles Brown as C.Q. Brown instead of General Charles Q. Brown, which was the reference that we saw first highlighted with this individual during the Manchurian period of time, where the military installation called Biden essentially maneuvered a lot of the game board and a lot of the militarized chess pieces for us for just such a time as this. And it's worth remembering that all of that occurred because of the time period that we are now living and what is very soon to come. So President Trump has added another initial here, and it does make sense, Charles C.Q. Brown, that there's nothing that's going to alert the senses of anyone that's not intentionally and very purposefully digging into this. But I find it very fascinating, the change and the addition of the C. And when you type in CQ with respect to signals intelligence, one of the first things that comes up is a marine vessel signal from the naval days of old, so to speak. So this going back to the early 20th century, if a marine vessel utilizes the signal CQ, it means they are sending a general call to action to any nearby ships. The message is essentially translated as all stations. This is a broadcast general message and is a way to contact any vessel within range, similar to how a radio operator might use CQ on land to reach any listening station. So in other words, this is clearly a message, right? This is clearly a reference to the broader war here. It's a call to action in some regards for certain parties. I couldn't begin to speculate who those parties might be, Patriots. But the timestamp of the truth put out itself also points to sort of the same general flavor, right? The same understanding that there is a next phase that individuals on some end of that receiving mechanism and message need to be ready and prepared for that phase. And so this dropped 1930, taken from August 20th, 2018, and I arrived there by the 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time timestamp being converted to military time of 1930 Patriots. This Q drop includes a clip, 3 minutes and 33 seconds of Jeff Sessions from X, and I actually had to go back and use the Wayback Machine to find the post referenced here because it was not allowed to stay up, of course, by the platform that was formerly Twitter when this occurred. So it was before. I apologize. Then it was before the X reference there during the time that it was still Twitter. And so this particular post linked over, I eventually found the video. I couldn't play the video on the Wayback Machine, but I found the video, the full interview that was given by Mr. Sessions at the Federalist Society. So that, again, for those folks out there that are sort of confused by my reasoning out as I go through this process, we have a Q drop being arrived at from the timestamp of President Trump's TruthSocial, clearly sending an irregular warfare message. And that particular Q drop references this video message given by Jeff Sessions in November of 2017, no less. Give me a moment here. So that would have been immediately after the Q drops first came out. Dealing a little bit with a browser issue on this end. Allow me just a moment, Patriots. I've gone through this a couple of different times, and I find it absolutely fascinating, Patriots, this particular segment of the video. I believe this is the segment that was being referenced by the Wayback Machine here, calling back this post. But of course, without being able to play the video within that removed post, it's impossible to verify that. But listen to this segment. It sounds very much as though Mr. Sessions is telling us to trust the process and to understand that this process is moving forward aggressively, affirmatively, and in real time, which is exactly the flavor coming from President Trump's TruthSocial account over the last 7 days.
I think this is what the American people expect and deserve from the Department of Justice. And we will not confirm investigations or leak sensitive law enforcement information to get a few cheap headlines. I am determined, we are determined as a team in the Department of Justice to reestablish.
I apologize, Patriots. I think we have to come just slightly further back here for this particular message.
I don't know how many times you've seen a mandamus on discovery be granted, but this one was, and we appreciate the appellate court for doing so. And so, although some district courts have initially ruled against us, I'm confident our positions will be vindicated in the Court of Appeals and, if necessary, in the Supreme Court. The President Trump has the statutory authority to suspend immigration in the law of any individual or group of individuals he thinks, he deems are contrary to the national interest. His rational, narrow proclamation of a pause from certain countries that are dysfunctional and provide risk is justified within his powers as the chief executive who has the responsibility to protect the public interest, and we're proud to vigorously defend it. So before I conclude, let me say this. There are those in this room, and maybe more than a few in this room, who get frustrated about when they turn on the TV at night, and you have to take Rolaids, and everybody's got an opinion about what the Attorney General should do or what someone else should do. Well, I get frustrated too. A lot of things I'd like to be able to say and explain, but the rule of law isn't always about getting the outcome we seek. It's using the same fair process, pursuing the truth wherever it leads.
The rule of law is not about just the outcome, but it is about pursuing the truth, using the same process, pursuing the truth wherever it may lead.
We can never allow any part of our legal system, and least of all, the Department of Justice, to be reduced to a tool for a political agenda.
We can never allow our Department of Justice to be utilized as a tool for a political agenda. In essence, Patriots, Attorney General Sessions, when this address occurred at the Federalist Society, was telling us and telling the Anons out there immediately after basically the inauguration of that entity online called Q, that we were going to utilize the pattern and the rule of law against them in an appropriate and honorable way, following that truth wherever it may lead, even though sometimes it may be inconvenient for the parties, certainly the parties being targeted by those operations, but parties who are waiting to see what occurs as a result of those operations. And that, of course, includes each and every one of us. One of the chief complaints I've seen in recent days with respect to the pace of events is that there have not been those public arrests that I told each of you have happened in many cases already, and indeed they have. But other arrests are soon to come and have always been in the works based on exactly what Attorney General Sessions just said. The investigative process against a power structure that has committed decades of criminality is not accomplished in weeks or months. It has to be fully fleshed out. It has to be completely historically accounted for. It has to be appropriately recorded in the entirety of the written record. And it has to be gently dripped out, and then in a more accelerated fashion, and then in a very accelerated fashion, out into the general public of the world for them to understand the nature of the events that have happened here and what has actually occurred to their society, to their systems, to their institutions and organizations, both in their own community and around their nation and around their world. And that's a difficult pill in many cases to take, because it requires the complete and total augmentation of a belief system. And so in my opinion, Patriots, when we talk about the pace of things, we have to keep in mind that this is a pace that is bringing the entire consciousness of mankind along for the ride. And many of us are simply in the spearhead 10 to 20% of that consciousness that have been awake to these particular realities and fully understanding and immersed in these realities for a very, very long time. You know, one of the things that's going to come, I think, in this process, Patriots, is the realization out of Fort Knox that gold is there, but it's being purposefully undervalued and hidden and kept away from the American people. And in fact, in many cases, is not even owned by the American Treasury. These are, I think, exposés that are going to occur with respect to the Fort Knox audit to come. And this is a little bit of a speculation on my part. But Q does tell us that we have the gold, directly addresses the question, do we have the gold, and responds with the answer, yes. So I do think we're going to find that the gold is there, but a completely different condition on the ground and inside these vaults exists from what we've always been led and what we've always been told. There is a reason that such forces as the U.S. Senate, as the U.S. military, and others are extremely resistant into auditing and examining places like this. And Fort Knox, of course, is not the only one. When we look at the events happening in the domestic landscapes, not only of the United States, but the entirety of the Western world, the movement and repatriation of metals from countries here and there, the repatriation of gold from London to vaults ostensibly in the state of New York, here in the United States of America, the presence of the J.P. Morgan vault, one of the largest private bank vaults, in the world, under One Chase Plaza, I believe is the address, Manhattan, being directly across the street, essentially less than 35 feet by the way of underground tunnels, 35 to 50 feet from the actual doorway, tunnels, and access ways to the underground vault of the New York Federal Reserve Building. You know, these are things that I think are going to be brought out in the broader discussion here, and Fort Knox is simply the symbolic gateway to reintroduce us to what has been an issue happening inside the United States for a long time, carried out by the same entities responsible for the construction of that CNO desk that we talked about a moment ago, and the complete overlooking, if you will, the creation of a Gotham-style permissive environment for criminality, the likes of which Jeff Sessions talks about in that speech and in further addressing there at the Federalist Society. And I encourage each of you out there to look through that. You know, Patriots, we are living in a remarkable and incredible time, and the pressure happening around the world, especially in the financial and the legal/judicial component, is going to really affect, I believe, the international events happening at the geopolitical and the militarized stage at the surface level of the world. In other words, not the underground a silent war, but the more overt warfare scenarios happening on the surface of the planet. And I think one of those scenarios likely to have fuel poured on its fire very soon is Israel, Iran, and the overall Middle East conflict. You know, the Russians have been telling the world for a couple of years now that there is a serious chance that the Israelis will become so emboldened by the actions of the Western world that they will strike against Iran. And this is a red line essentially for Moscow. And they've made that very clear that they would potentially enter such a conflict on behalf of Iran, especially if such an attack occurred on any of the nuclear missile sites held there in the Iranian region of influence in the Middle East. And we have to remember, Patriots, that that does not just mean inside the nation state borders of Iran. I believe with the recent activities of the current administration in the United States of America, as well as other individuals and administrations in power in Western Europe and in NATO countries, we're going to see such an emboldening, if you will, of the Israeli deep state apparatus, the Israeli Mossad and deep IDF control community that have been essentially in an unchallenged position of influence and power for more than a half century. I believe they're going to make crucial and existential mistakes as a result of that emboldenment. And I'm looking at that emboldenment on behalf of the Trump White House as purposefully bateful, as purposefully a sleight of hand to draw one's enemy out, to make them, you know, very comfortable, to quite literally walk them in the front door, sit down with them and make merry with them so that you can encourage them into patterns of decision making and destruction, which will forever, alter the geopolitical and power dynamics in a region. And I believe we're seeing the preparation for that now. Taken from a very recent article. Give me just a moment here to pull this up. We've seen a number of different commentators in recent days discussing this, but this article in particular I thought was very appropriate. Give me just a moment. Taken from the Middle Eastern news outlet Iran International. Iran nuclear sites now on high alert amid attack concerns. Iran has placed its nuclear sites on high alert, deploying additional defenses amid escalating fears of an Israeli-US attack. Citing two unnamed government sources, the outlet said the Islamic Republic has also been bolstering defenses around key nuclear and missile sites, which include the deployment of additional air defense systems. Recent developments, including Donald Trump's comments and reports about potential plans from his administration, have further intensified these activities. The report follows warnings from U.S. intelligence to both the Biden and Trump administrations that Israel would likely target key Iranian nuclear sites this year. So we talked about this initially, Patriots, in late 2023, early 2024. It looks like we were probably about a year early in that. And it's been prophesied a number of different times by a number of different groups and individuals that have not had any sort of commonality with one another and that have spanned a number of years between the events, that something like this would occur in the Middle East, that there would be some sort of radioactive or nuclear event, or perhaps a series of those types of events, as we've seen the United States, military domestically undertaking a number of operations and training exercises just in the last 8 weeks regarding nuclear, chemical, high explosive, and biological events. But fundamentally, it's been harbingered many times that that an event or a series of events like this would occur in the Middle East and potentially affect the rest of the world. This article from the Times of Israel, so literally on the other side of that same coin in the Middle East, Britain's Telegraph quotes an Iranian source who says everything is on high alert. Iran now deploying air defenses to brace for possible Israeli-U.S. strike. So there's a lot of conflation here between Israeli and U.S. with respect to these strikes. Whether or not we see something like that in a joint fashion from the Trump administration or not, I think that's going to be what's going to write the history books, right? That's going to be fundamentally how this process moves forward. If the Iranian nuclear sites are struck militarily by NATO or occultic associated Western world militaries, then you're clearly going to have a major escalation on behalf of regional powers, to include Turkey and to include Russia. So this would be a very serious situation where President Trump, through his prowess as a negotiator, as a hardline individual, but as a sensible and a pragmatic person as well, would probably be able to help wind down, but likely not able to prevent completely. Taken from this article, Iran has placed nuclear facilities on high alert. According to a report from the Telegraph, Tehran has deployed additional air defense system launchers around key nuclear and missile sites. An official told the Telegraph that there was an understanding in Tehran that Iran's air defenses may not be effective, may not be totally effective in the event of a large-scale coalition strike. Last year, Israel carried out a wave of retaliatory airstrikes across Iran after Tehran carried out a second missile attack on Israel with respect to the death of their official in Syria. Israeli jets targeted Iranian air defenses and ballistic missile program facilities, including factories, storage sites, launchers, and research facilities, and targeted one facility believed to be used for the pursuit of a nuclear weapon. Patriots, as we look at what's happening in the world, as we look at the wind down of the old way of financial and value exchange here on the planet over the last 1,000 years, and the preparation clearly of a new way of life, as we look at the activities of the U.S. military all around the entirety of the planet, and certainly here at home domestically, as we look at the activities undertaken by the Trump administration just so far, and individuals inside that administration, as we examine the entirety of the 85,000 foot or 89,000 foot, if you'd like to keep with the symbolism for today's file, view of what's happening here in the world, we have incredible cause for encouragement and also vigilance as we go through a public expository process. This will be a period of discovery for those that have chided us, lauded us, perhaps made fun of us along in this journey, characterized us as the lovable, crazy aunts, uncles, grandparents, and grandchildren over these last many years. It is going to be a period of intense unity, of intense understanding. It is going to be a period of bringing the true shadow power structures, both private and public interest, out into the light in ways that are going to redefine and reshape, in some cases, national borders and boundaries. There is a reason President Trump and Putin are meeting in Saudi Arabia. There is a reason that the events happening in the Middle East are escalating in direct proportion to the threatening, not only of the financial changeover of the world, but the complete redefinition of worldwide energy markets, which has been cornerstone and paramount to that deep state control on mankind and the ability of mankind to advance itself for the entirety of their existence as controllers in this realm. They are losing, patriots, not just the war, but the entirety of their future, the entirety of their history. And they are losing the ability, and indeed have now lost the ability, to affect the macro consciousness, our oneness together through that beautiful and mighty Holy Spirit. They have now officially lost the ability to affect, divide, and orient and position us against one another. We have to consciously look for our encouragement, but it is there. Faith without works is not really faith at all, as the good book says. And so we have to be steadfast in our knowing, open-minded in our discovery and the expansion of our awareness. And we also have to be willing to acknowledge that the journey itself unfolds, even though certain components of it are happening perhaps not as quickly as we would appreciate. As you spend some time today after listening to our file, I hope you will reflect more than anything on where God and where the Almighty is pulling you at this day and in this moment. Are you pulled to spend some time outside or to busy yourself with activities at home? Are you pulled to give your spouse or your loved ones a hug, or to spend some time investing in your own, what we would call self-care, return to centeredness and return to the peace that surpasses all understanding, either with the good book or a good book? Wherever you are pulled, and whatever ignites your intuitive connection to God's Holy Spirit today, I hope that you will appreciate and understand that you are witnessing the transformation of the old world into the new, right before your very eyes. This is SGAnon, everyone. I'll be back with each of you again soon on the Q News Patriot. God bless. Stay safe today. Thanks. Bye-bye.